To me, one of the most interesting aspects of Equinox is how many different things their various abilities can potentially be good at. And it kind of begs the question to me, how many of them can you make good at the same time? Of course, there are plenty of good Equinox builds that are good at something, and you could make a well-rounded build that was, okay, passable at a lot of things. Sure, you could. But what about a build that is really good, essentially no compromises, a full-featured build, good at a lot of things that Equinox can potentially be good at, without really sacrificing anything? What about a build like that? That's what I want. And I think that I have something for you today. Behold, the ultimate Sleep Equinox. The three builds to discuss here are Sleep, so that's a rest-focused strategy, Maim, and just to be clear, when I say a Maim-focused strategy, I'm not talking about that tiny, tiny amount of damage that Maim does when enemies get in range. That's insignificant, except at very low levels. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not any good at that, at anything beyond very low levels. I'm talking about how it stores damage, and then you can release that damage to do extraordinarily high, millions and millions of damage to enemies, provided that you store it up. That's what I'm talking about. And then there's Duality, which will activate over the course of using Rest and Maim. And of course, we can use Maim and charge it up while using Rest because of energy transfer. Talking about Maim first. So this ability, when used, when storing up damage and then you release it and it does this big spike of damage, not for that tiny little insignificant damage that happens when enemies get in range, for that gigantic spike of damage that can kill basically everything in a radius, provided you store enough damage, that thing, that's not affected by strength. It just does the damage you've stored. So you want it to store up damage in a very large area. So you might simply add on all of the range, and you get some negative strength, which we'll come back to in a moment, but you've got all this range, right? So now Maim, barring the energy drain, is essentially as good as it's going to be. It now hits in a very large area, and the strength doesn't really matter, and as long as you can maintain it, as long as you have enough energy, you're pretty much good to go. So let's just add a few concessions to make sure you can keep the ability active. I'll just add a little bit of duration and efficiency. Now the ability is only 1.5 energy per second, not half bad, right? This combination of mods is very good for rest. The only problem, of course, is that if you're charging up Maim and you're in day form, and then you swap to night form, well, it cancels Maim channeling, and then you're not storing up that damage anymore. It would be nice to defend yourself by using Rest to sleep enemies while you kill them and charge up damage for Maim, but you can't do that by default. Enter Energy Transfer. I know that this is one of those augments that should really be innate. It should just be a part of the ability innately, but it isn't, and it does let you do the thing I just described. You can activate Maim with this on, and then swap to night form, still charging up that damage, and then swap back to day form to unleash that big slash explosion when it's charged up sufficiently to kill enemies at the level that you're fighting. Just slap that on there, and now you'll see that I can activate Maim in day form, swap into night form, and it's still charging up. Night form and day form use the same damage charging thing, and then you swap back into day form when you want to explode everything and instant kill the entire room, and then reactivate it and go about your merry way. Loop that as much as you like. You don't have to reactivate it in night or day form in particular either. In fact, even better, the passive effect before you deactivate Maim or Mend in day form is pretty bad. As we discussed, at higher levels, the damage when enemies enter the radius of Maim is not particularly high. Yes, of course, we have negative strength, so it's even worse than it would normally be, but it's really just not that high. It's not significant against level 50, level 75, level 100 enemies that you really care about having a kill the entire room button against, right? But Mend's passive effect gives you overshields. You and your allies get overshields whenever you kill an enemy in the radius. That's, it's not amazing because we do have negative strength, but it's still a lot better than completely meaninglessly small slash damage. Okay, so then you've got this as your build. What next? Well, an aura would be nice. And Maim has, a problem. When you're trying to kill armored enemies at higher levels, you can do it, but you need to store up a lot of damage because they have a lot of damage reduction. So Corrosive Projection is a really good fit. And then the other thing you might want to address is survivability. Yes, it's true that you can put enemies to sleep, sleep from a very large range, which is nice, but it's very nice to have some kind of damage buffer as well. Rolling Guard. This is a decent fit when you're not going to be vulnerable all the time. You can put enemies to sleep, but you don't want to have to put enemies to sleep constantly. Personally, this isn't usually my preference, unless the Warframe is passively completely safe or maybe invisible, and then they become vulnerable for a time. If you need to be actively defending yourself anyway, personally, I feel like taking a break from actively defending yourself to actively defend yourself it's just not my cup of tea, but it's not a bad solution here. Personally, I think that there is a better solution, and it's Pillage. This ability is a very elegant way to get a lot of survivability with very little space on your build. Essentially, by itself, this ability can make you pretty much safe. You're just going to have to recast it pretty often if enemies are going to be attacking you unmitigated, but they're not. You're going to be doing quite a bit to interfere with them. So this will give you a damage buffer of overshields, which you can store up without any other shield mods or anything. That passive overshield cap of 1200 really rewards you here and keeps you safe without any mod investment, which lets you use all the space to put more stuff on the build while you have this big overshield buffer. And then when you do get hit, you have plenty of time to just sleep enemies quickly and then cast out Pillage and restore your overshields, which is really nice. It's a really elegant way to get survivability in the build without really using a lot of mods. As a nice bonus, Pillage does remove armor, of course, shields and armor from enemies. That's how you get the overshields. You don't remove very much because the strength is negative, but removing a little bit of armor is still pretty good for MAME, and you can do this ability multiple times, of course, if you so chose. Like Rolling Guard, it also removes status effects from you. So then you've got the remaining space in the build. I personally like the option to survive a little bit of head-on damage if I want to. So Adaptation is what I'm choosing to put in this slot. I think that adding Arcane Aegis is a pretty big boon for this strategy, because when this activates, you're essentially just unkillable for a while. Adaptation synergizes well because you're regenerating, and then shield gating and such. But the point is, it keeps you alive pretty effectively. If you have this, it's a great fit here. If you don't, I think that makes Adaptation a lot less valuable. You might want to choose something else. But I like this, and I'm going to put it here. And then you have one more slot. And as mentioned before, I'm going to be putting Duality in that slot. The reason for that is that this damage percentage increase is not affected by strength. We have negative strength, and this is kind of the opposite situation with Rest. Rest wants range, and MAME also wants range and doesn't mind the negative strength. This is a case where, well, we already have negative strength, so what can we do that takes advantage of the situation? Normally, being unaffected by strength would be considered bad, because that means you can't make it more powerful. But in this case, it also means you can't make it less powerful, which allows your clone to be fairly powerful. And this Metamorphosis clone gets to use the mods on your guns, which allows them to do decent damage. Now, I'm not trying to sell you something questionable here. The AI for Spectres and companions in general is, as you can see here, my clone hasn't really figured out that it needs to go up, and it spent some time trying to shoot. It's spending more time trying to shoot. My Sentinel is also trying to shoot while just behind this wall. That's not ideal, but sometimes it will jump out in front of enemies, and the more likely thing is that you'll just spawn it where it's able to mow down a couple of enemies for you. As you can see, the damage it deals is quite substantial. It fires the Act Jagera Prime at a very fast rate, almost like an automatic weapon. Actually, speaking of which, that's why I've chosen the Act Jagera Prime here. A little weapon recommendation if you're going to pick something with your clone. Act Jagera Prime, like many semi-auto weapons in Warframe, well, it's a burst weapon, but it's a semi-auto trigger. This is a weapon that doesn't really do very good damage. Its damage output, its status output, is not very high unless you fire it as if it was a full auto weapon. Here I'm going to use the mouse wheel. Like that, it's a pretty powerful weapon, and it reloads quickly. It's fairly accurate as well. It's a nice weapon, but if you fire it by tapping it like this damage is really unimpressive. It's really not quite there. This is true of a lot of semi-automatic weapons in Warframe. They're just kind of bad unless you fire them faster than you normally would be able to, or if you can spam clicking really quickly. But if you're on console or something that is more prohibitive, it's also not good for your hands. So firing them, you can use the mouse wheel. But the point is that your clone, your Duality clone, does fire them really quickly, so that makes this a pretty good choice. It's not the only, far from the only good choice, but that's why I'm recommending this particular weapon in this case. I also really like how aesthetically the Act Jagera Prime has these two blades. So you've got that one blade pointing up and then this one blade pointing down, and when you reload the weapon, you kind of use the blades to pull the, I don't know how that reloads it, but anyway, you know, the reload animation does that thing. And I sort of like the asymmetry along with a frame like Equinox that has two different forms. I don't know, to me that's kind of nice, and it happens to work very well with this particular warframe in this particular loadout. So companions, look at this cute little death cube. No, come back, it's okay. Come on out, come here. There you go, good job. Oh, who's a good Death Cube Prime? Who's gonna poop out some energy today? Energy Generator is a good way to top this loadout off. A lot of the time when I'm making a loadout, what I recommend besides the warframe and its build, very frequently it's some kind of energy source, and I often have a lot of trouble determining exactly the amount of energy you want. Furthermore, I'm not sure it's true that the amount of energy you get, the power level of the energy source, really correlates to how much of a sacrifice it is. So for example, this is your companion slot. You get one of those. There's a lot of stuff in the companion slot. Come on, buddy, don't be shy. We're just talking about you. You're doing great. The companion slot has, you know, it's got a lot of options, but a lot of them are pretty specific. So it's quite possible you're building a loadout, you don't really need one. It's debatable how valuable this slot is. If you have a lot of options, a lot of the time, a lot of them are not relevant, and a lot of the time, a lot of them are relevant. So it depends. Whereas let's say your melee, you know, you could run a Zaw that has Exodia Hunt, Exodia Brave. I said Exodia Hunt out of impulse because it's so powerful. Exodia Brave. And having your melee weapon provide you energy, that's not much of a sacrifice. It can still do really good damage, but it is a sacrifice because of other Exodias, which can be really powerful. Having an Exodia Hunt Zaw on your loadout is really good, and giving that up for Exodia Brave is... It doesn't mean you have a bad melee weapon now, but it means you don't have a very, very powerful way to use a certain melee weapon. So it is a different kind of sacrifice. You can see what I mean. It's a bit difficult to figure out how to evaluate what you're giving up when you use a certain source of energy. So here I've decided to recommend Death Cube, and I'll tell you why. It's because this loadout is usually going to be effective against large groups of enemies. At the end of the day, while I have shown you a build that can effectively perform duality, rest, and maim all at the same time, rest and maim are both kind of bad most of the time unless you're against a lot of enemies. No, we're not talking about that very specific affinity farming technique with rest. Just in general, in a normal mission, if you're doing a normal exterminate, I question how powerful these abilities would really be. It just seems like overkill. You don't really need that much range. There are probably more efficient ways to just dispatch the enemies and move on. This is more effective when you're against a truly huge number of enemies. And against a truly huge number of enemies, Death Cube's energy generator is a very good way to generate a lot of energy. And Sweeper Prime is the weapon that I'm going to recommend if Death Cube will stop being so shy as to let us look at its device. Sweeper Prime Sweeper is fine, is a shotgun, and it's a hit scan shotgun, which means it doesn't have any travel time. So you can see as I move behind this wall, you see all those pellets popping up on it, and you see how they're very spread out, even though the Sweeper is only shooting 1 or 2 shots at a time. That's because the weapon has a lot of spread. It's just got a really big spread cone. And you can see that the pellets are fairly even in that spread cone, which means that the Sweeper is going to hit many enemies unintentionally. Sentinels, and AI in general, I'm looking at you, Duality Clone, don't do a good job of dividing up their attention between targets. They just fixate on one thing. So if you want a Sentinel to hit many targets and get lots of assists, you need to use a weapon that's inaccurate or has an AoE in some way. And there are a few options, but Sweeper pulls ahead in my mind because, again, it's hit scan, so there's no travel time. Enemies, if they're in a group, bam, it snapshots them and gets a hit on all of them. And it's also got a lot of pellets. It just can hit many different things at once. And I've made this build to make it better at that. Pretty simple, multi-shot, so it's got more chances to hit. Some reload. Sentinel weapons like companions and such in general don't have ammo, but they do need to reload if applicable. Vicious spread makes the spread cone bigger, so you can hopefully hit even more enemies. And then some fire rate, so that you can hit enemies faster. I also included a bit of punch through. I'm not sure how often this is helping. This is a very difficult thing to test, but in general, the idea here is that your Sentinel is going to see a group of enemies that just spawned in. It's going to shoot probably only one time before you or some ally obliterates all of the enemies. And in that one shot, the hit scan pellets are going to fan out and hit most of the enemies in the crowd, possibly punching through some, hopefully spreading out to hit some on the edges if it targets something in the middle. You get the idea. And that will give your Death Cube a bunch of assists, 4 or 5, a big handful of assists when that group of enemies dies. And that means that every couple of groups of enemies you kill, you're probably going to get an energy orb. There are other options here. There are things like the Hellstrom that do a pretty good job hitting multiple targets because it has an explosion radius, but it's slow. It's not hit scan, and not only is it not hit scan, they also just fly slowly. That's slow. It's not a bad option, but it is slow. This is more effective if you're in closer ranged enemies. Death Machine Rifle Prime is kind of a good compromise between more damage from your Sentinel weapon, if you care about that, and still being good at tagging because this weapon is fairly inaccurate. And the Vergless would be the option if you don't care about tagging enemies in particular and you just want your Sentinel to do a lot of damage and status output. That's an option. This is kind of an in-between. This is all tagging. This is sort of a melee tagging focused option that I don't think is particularly competitive with these options. So I'm going to recommend the Sweeper, and that's why I think Death Cube does a nice job here. And can we talk about the Death Cube fashion? This little cutie won't stop swoosing behind. Oh yes, it clipped on the side of my, oh there it is. Oh, so cute, they're together. Oh man, there's nowhere else to go but to talk about this fashion frame. Where do we even begin? Equinox has a lot of fashion considerations. The first one, and this is not necessary, but I think it's kind of nice, is the emissive color. So on Equinox, this determines which of the two forms you start in. And on this build, the way that I've talked about the gameplay flow, you generally want to start in day form, so you can activate Maim and then swap into night form. So I chose to have a light energy color so you can start in day form. I also personally think that if you're going to maintain the Mend and Maim field, you kind of want a very dark or a very light neutral energy color, because if you don't have that, well, actually, let me show you. So I'm going to choose a sort of yellow energy color, and I'm going to activate Maim, and the whole world just kind of becomes this wan color. I don't know. In a way, I sort of like this. It's like a noir film, but I don't know. Anyway, be aware of that and don't do it if you don't like it. I just think that's important. I fiddled around with the energy colors for this strategy for quite some time. This is what I ended up liking. I think it's nice to have something a little more low key because you're going to be seeing those energy effects a lot of the time. Customize it to your own tastes, but I do think it's important to take a look at your powers. One benefit of doing things in the Simulacrum is we can easily compare that. Anyway, otherwise this fashion is a balancing act. It's about making night and day form look good, at least to me, at the same time. Night form is the tricky part here by my estimation, and the reason is the shoulder armor. I think it's very difficult to find a shoulder armor piece that looks good on night form and day form. A lot of them on night form, maybe they just look out of place on day form or something, and a lot of the time they don't fit over the shoulders correctly. It's worth noting, whenever we talk about this, the Digital Extremes places every armor piece manually, so they tried, right? It's just hard. They're really different. I mean, look at... Day form is very different looking than night form with this skin. They're just not that similar, I like both forms a lot, but I found it hard to find fashion that I liked on both. Another little feature here that I ended up really enjoying is this Syandana. So this Syandana is meant to sort of mirror this kind of rib effect on the Prime day form, with the rib thing that is holding the Telos sword. I think that looks nice. It also charges up as you get kills and becomes red, which is similar to the red color that we have here. Oh, finally, I chose to use the Tenebris Ephemera, which I think looks really cool over the head part. Yeah, that part right there. Okay, anyway, enough about the fashion. Oh, little Death Cube, what are you doing? Is floating over my head. So cute. Do you think that this was an effective way to combine these three different playstyles? Just feels like a really good general use Warframe that's good at killing everything in a huge room of enemies. There are a lot of generalist Warframes in Warframe, or Warframes I would call generalists, and I feel like Equinox stands out with this particular playstyle as one that's really good against huge numbers of enemies, really sticks out as being a horde killer in a horde shooter. So I hope you enjoyed that very much. Happy hunting.